Over the last 6 months, I've been reviewing every single character in Castle Crashers in just 1 minute, and in this video, I'm going to be showing you all of those reviews. And this video was a bit painful to make, so liking the video would be much appreciated. Anyways, hope you enjoy. You can unlock the Snakey character by beating the game with the Thief. And this character doesn't unlock anyone after you complete the game with him. This character's starting weapon is the Snakey Mace, which gives the player +5 magic, -2 defense, and +3 agility, and also has a 2% poison chance. Anyways, let's talk about Snakey's magic. His light magic throws a basic knife that does pretty average damage, and his heavy magic throws roots from the ground. Snakey's a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion is armor pierce. Alright, I've talked about Snakey enough. It's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. Snakey's actually a really solid character. His heavy magic is great against bosses and decent against other enemies, and his light magic isn't anything crazy, but it gets the job done. Snakey also has a pretty cool starting weapon, so for that, I'm gonna give Snakey an 8 out of 10. The Industrialist can be unlocked by completing the game with the Blue Knight, and after you beat the game with the Industrialist, you unlock the Fencer. The Industrialist starting weapon is the Ugly Mace, which gives the player +6 defense, -2 magic, and has a 1% crit chance. This character's light magic throws a saw blade at enemies that does pretty high damage, and his heavy magic throws saws from the ground that hit enemies multiple times. And also the Industrialist is a non-elemental character, so his elemental infusion is armor pierce, which does 4 times base damage. Now that I've given the Industrialist a pretty basic overview, it's time for me to give my final thoughts about him. I think the Industrialist is arguably the best character in the game. His saws are insane against bosses, and they're also pretty good against beefy enemies, and not only is he good, but he's really easy to get. I mean, all you have to do is beat the game once with one of the best characters in the game. So after all that, I'm gonna give the Industrialist a 9.5 out of 10. Since the Green Knight is one of the 4 starting knights in Castle Crashers, he should already be unlocked after you purchase the game. And after you complete the game with the Green Knight, you unlock the Royal Guard. Anyways, this character's starting weapon is the Thin Sword, which gives the player +1 agility. Alright, time to talk about the Green Knight's magic. His light magic shoots a poison ball that poisons enemies for a short amount of time, and his heavy magic is a gust of poison. Since the Green Knight's a poison character, his elemental infusion is going to be the poison attack, which knocks enemies to the ground and makes them take a few ticks of damage. Anyways, I've been talking about the Green Knight for a little bit, so now it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. The Green Knight is not good, and here's why. He does a backflip when he's doing his heavy attack, which slows down his DPS and makes it way harder to juggle with him. And not being able to juggle alone is really bad for insane mode. And also, his magic isn't really that great, so combining that with the terrible heavy attack, I'm gonna have to give him a 5 out of 10. Before I play the next review, if you guys are enjoying this video so far, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps me out a ton, and this video took me a really long time to make. Anyways, back to the video. You can unlock this character by purchasing the Pink Knight DLC, which should cost you around $1. And since the Pink Knight is a DLC character, they don't unlock anyone after you complete the game with them. Anyways, the Pink Knight's starting weapon is the Lollipop, which gives the player +5 agility. This character's light magic throws a bear or penguin, and their heavy magic throws a rainbow that can stun enemies in place. And the Pink Knight's a non-elemental character, so their elemental infusion is armor pierce, which does 4 times base damage. Anyways, I've talked about the Pink Knight enough. It's time for me to give my overall opinion. Even though the heavy magic does cost a lot of mana, it's so good for stunning enemies, cause after you do that, you can just start juggling and do whatever you want from there. So since the Pink Knight has pretty good magic, I'm gonna give him a 7.5 out of 10. But anyways, the Conehead can be unlocked by completing the Lava Arena, and after beating the game with the Conehead, you don't unlock any other characters. This character's starting weapon is the Lightsaber, which gives +2 agility and has a 2% electric chance. Alright, let's talk about the Conehead's magic. The Conehead's light magic shoots a bomb projectile that explodes on enemies, also dealing fire damage, and his heavy magic makes arrows rain from the sky. Since the Conehead's a non-elemental character, his elemental infusion attack is armor pierce, which does 4 times base damage. Now that I've given the Conehead a pretty basic overview, it's time for my completely honest, non-biased overall opinion. The Conehead is the best character in the game. He's super good and definitely not but in all honesty, the Conehead is mid. His magic is definitely not the best. I mean, the bombs aren't too bad, but the arrow rain is just not good. His elemental infusion is one of the best in the game, but other than that, I'm gonna have to give the Conehead a 6 out of 10. The Orange Knight should already be unlocked since he's one of the 4 starting knights in the game, so you don't have to do anything to unlock him. And after you beat the game with the Orange Knight, you unlock the Fire Demon. This character's starting weapon is the Broad Axe, which gives the player +1 strength. Anyways, let's talk about the character's magic. The Orange Knight's light magic throws a fireball that sets enemies on fire. I know, it's pretty complicated. And his heavy magic throws a gust of fire at enemies, which can hit multiple targets at a time. Since the Orange Knight is a fire character, his elemental infusion is a fire slash, which does 2 times base damage and sets enemies on fire. Alright, now that I've been talking about the Orange Knight for a little bit, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. Personally, I think the Orange Knight is one of the better characters in the game. His magic is very reliable, and he's overall a pretty decent character. And also, since he's one of the 4 starting knights, you don't have to do anything to unlock him, and that's why I'm gonna give the Orange Knight a 7 out of 10. You can unlock the Thief by defeating the Thief's Arena, and after you complete the game with him, you unlock Snakey. This character's starting weapon is the Thief's Sword, which is pretty self-explanatory. And the Thief's Sword gives the player +3 agility and -1 strength. Anyways, let's talk about the Thief's magic. His light magic throws a knife that knocks over enemies, and his heavy magic throws arrows from the sky. And the Thief is a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion is Armor Pierce, which does 4 times base damage to enemies. Now that I've given the Thief a basic overview, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. The Thief is just not a good character. His magic is not good at all. I mean, pretty much every single character has knives and arrow rain, and his starting weapon also isn't that great, so I'm gonna have to give the Thief a 4.5 out of 10. Sorry, Thief fans. You can unlock this character by beating the Catfish in Insane mode, and after you beat the game with him, you don't unlock anyone. The open-faced Grey Knight starting weapon is the Skinny Sword, which gives the player +1 defense, +1 agility, and takes away 1 strength. This character's light magic throws a knife that knocks over enemies on contact, and his heavy magic rains arrows from the sky. And the open-faced Grey Knight is a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion is Armor Pierce, which does ×4 base damage. Now that I've talked about the open-faced Grey Knight for a little bit, it's time for me to give my honest opinion on him. Overall, the open-faced Grey Knight is just not that great. His magic is super basic, and he's actually quite hard to get for having such bad magic. But one thing I will say is he is better than the regular Grey Knight, as his elemental infusion does more damage. Anyways, the open-faced Grey Knight is pretty disappointing for how hard it is to get him, so I'm gonna give him a 5.5 out of 10. This character can be unlocked by completing the game with the Grey Knight, and after beating the game with the Stoveface, you don't unlock anyone. Anyways, the Stoveface starting weapon is the Gladiator, which gives the player +3 defense, +1 strength, -1 magic, and has a 1% crit chance. This character's light magic throws a curved knife at enemies, and his heavy magic rains arrows from the sky. And I know I don't have elemental infusion unlocked yet, but according to the Castle Crasher wiki, his elemental infusion is Armor Pierce. Alright, now that I've talked about the Stoveface for a pretty good chunk of time, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. Overall, the Stoveface is just not good. The only good thing about him is he has a pretty solid starting weapon, but since arrow rain and knives are just not that good, I'm gonna have to give the Stoveface a 5.5 out of 10. But anyways, you can unlock this character by completing the game with the Royal Guard, and after you beat the game with the Saracen, you don't unlock any characters. The Saracen's starting weapon is the Falcon, I think that's how you pronounce it, and this gives the player +1 strength and +3 defense. Alright, let's talk about the Saracen's magic. This character's light magic throws dust from the ground that deals low damage to multiple enemies, and his heavy magic is a tornado that constantly does damage to enemies. And the Saracen is a non-elemental character, so his elemental infusion is Armor Pierce, and that does 4 times base damage. Now that I've given the Saracen a pretty basic overview, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. Overall, the Saracen is a pretty solid character. Even though his light magic doesn't do a lot of damage, it's good for starting easy juggles, and also his tornado is quite good, so I'm gonna give the Saracen an 8 out of 10. You can unlock this character by either buying Battle Block Theater or purchasing him in the Insane store. And since this character is technically a DLC character, you don't unlock anybody after you complete the game with him. Anyways, Hatty's starting weapon is the Gem Sword, which gives the player +3 magic and takes away 1 agility. His light magic is tears that get shot from his eyes, and his heavy magic is a golden whale that poops gold on onto enemies. And one really cool thing about this character is he actually has a third magic, which is the gem toss. And Hatty is also a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion does 4 times base damage. Okay, now for the moment you guys have been waiting for. It's time for my overall opinion on Hatty. I personally think Hatty is one of the coolest characters in the game. One reason for that is he's the only character with 3 different types of magics, and he's also a really fun character to play. But one bad part about Hatty is his heavy magic has a really long delay. What I mean by this is there's like a whole second from the time you activate his magic and the time the magic actually hits the enemy. And 1 second can be pretty crucial in certain situations. But besides that delay, Hatty's actually a pretty good character. I'm gonna give him a 7.5 out of 10. You can unlock him by completing the game with the Barbarian, and also the Beekeeper doesn't unlock anybody after you complete the game with him. Anyways, this character's starting weapon is the Bee-Bat, which gives the player +2 strength and +1 defense. The Beekeeper's magic is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, he just shoots bees. His light magic shoots 1 bee, and his heavy magic rains bees from the sky. And this character is also a non-elemental character, so that means his elemental infusion is armor pierce. Alright, now that I've given the Beekeeper a brief overview, it's time to give you guys my overall opinion on him. I am not a huge Beekeeper fan. Even though he's a very unique character, his magic is just not good. It does similar damage to arrow rain magic, and you guys know how I feel about that. The one thing I do like about the Beekeeper is that he's the only character in Castle Crashers that has bee magic, so I'm gonna give him an extra point for that. But anyways, his final score is gonna come up to a 6 out of 10. The bear can be unlocked by beating the game with the skeleton, but after beating the game with the bear, he doesn't unlock anybody. But anyways, the bear's starting weapon is the log, which in my opinion is one of the best weapons in the game since it gives so much strength and defense. The bear's light magic shoots a wind projectile that does pretty average damage, and his heavy magic is a tornado that does pretty solid damage. And the bear is also one of the only 2 characters that has this ability. He is also a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion attack is armor pierce. Okay, now that I've been talking about the bear for a second, it's time to give my overall opinion on him. In my opinion, the bear is actually one of the best knights in the game. His light magic is decent, but his heavy magic is really effective. The reason why is because it can hit multiple enemies and it does really good damage, and it's also pretty fun to use. But anyways, I'd give the bear an 8 out of 10. You can unlock this character by beating the alien ship level, and after beating the game with the alien, you don't unlock any other characters. This character's starting weapon is the alien gun, which gives the player a 1% fire chance. Okay, now let's talk about the alien's magic. His light magic shoots a blast from his gun, and his heavy magic shoots a bigger blast that sets enemies on fire. Even though I don't have it unlocked, the alien's elemental infusion attack is a fire attack, which does 2 times base damage and sets enemies on fire. Now that I've given you guys some information on the alien, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. Overall, I think the alien would be a very good character because his magic is pretty good, but one very big downside about the alien is that he cannot hold any other weapon except the alien gun, which is not very good. This fact about the alien definitely decreases his score a little bit, so that's why I'm gonna give the alien a 6 out of 10. This character can be unlocked after beating the game with the Orange Knight, and after you complete the game with the Fire Demon, you unlock the Ninja. Anyways, the Fire Demon's starting weapon is the Morning Star, which gives the player -3 strength, +1 magic, +1 defense, and has a 4% crit chance. The Fire Demon's light magic is a fireball, and his heavy magic is fire that comes up from the ground and knocks over enemies, also setting them on fire. And since the Fire Demon is obviously a fire character, his elemental infusion sets enemies on fire and does 4 times base damage. Alright, I've been talking about this character enough. It's time to give my overall opinion. The Fire Demon is a decent character. One really good thing about his magic is it does more damage than other magics do, as it sets them on fire. But other than that, his magic doesn't do anything crazy like stunning enemies or freezing them. I mean, obviously not freezing, but you get the point. But anyways, I'm gonna have to give the Fire Demon a 7.5 out of 10. The skeleton can be unlocked by completing the game with the Red Knight. The skeleton's starting weapon is the Skeletor Mace, which grants the player +3 defense, +5 agility, and -2 strength. The skeleton's light magic is Dark Shot, which shoots a dark projectile that moves faster than normal. His heavy magic is called Pillars of Darkness, which makes dark energy come up from the ground and hit your enemies. The skeleton is a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion is just armor pierce. After completing the game with him, you unlock the bear, Okay, now that I've given the skeleton a quick review, it's time to give my overall opinion on him. I think the skeleton is a pretty average character. He doesn't really have anything special, but his magic is pretty solid. I'd rank the skeleton a 6.5 out of 10. Pretty solid character. You unlock the brute by beating the game with the Icecomo. And also, the brute does not unlock anybody after beating the game with him, since he's unlocked by an arena character. But anyways, the brute's starting weapon is the dual pronged sword, which grants the player +3 strength, +3 defense, and a 1% crit chance. And it also looks pretty cool. The brute's light magic throws an acorn projectile that does pretty mediocre damage, and his heavy magic shoots vines from the ground that can hit enemies multiple times. This character is a non-elemental character, which pretty much means his elemental infusion is going to be armor pierce, which if you didn't know, just does 4 times the base damage of the sword. Alright, now that I've been talking about the brute for a little bit, it's time to give my overall opinion on him. I think the brute is actually one of the better knights in the game. His light magic might not be the best, but his heavy magic is insanely good on beefies and bosses. The vine magic is actually a little bit similar to the industrial magic, as it hits enemies like a ton of times, which is really useful. And the brute also looks really cool, so I'm gonna give him an extra half point. But anyways, I'd rank the brute an 8 out of 10. Really solid character. The cult minion can be unlocked by completing the ice castle in insane mode, and he doesn't unlock anybody after you beat the game with him. This character's starting weapon is the glow stick, which gives the player +4 magic, +4 defense, and -5 strength. Anyways, the cult minion has dark magic, which means his light magic shoots a ball of darkness, and his heavy magic makes darkness come up from the ground. And he's also a non-elemental character, so his elemental infusion is 4 times base damage. Now that I've given the cult minion a pretty basic overview, it's time to give my overall opinion. The cult minion has pretty decent magic. It's nothing crazy, but it's not the worst in the game. But since he has the same magic as the skeleton, I'm gonna have to give him the same ranking to be fair. So that means the cult minion is gonna get a 6.5 out of 10. Not too bad. The red knight is one of the 4 starting knights, so you should already have it unlocked after purchasing the game. And after completing the game with the red knight, you unlock the skeleton. This character's starting weapon is the mace, which gives the player a +1% crit chance. The red knight's light magic throws an electric ball that does pretty high damage, and his heavy magic is an electric charge that stuns enemies for a few seconds, also hitting them multiple times. Since the red knight is an electricity character, his elemental infusion electrocutes enemies for a short amount of time and also does 2 times base damage. Alright, now that I've been talking about the red knight for a bit, it's time to give my overall opinion. The red knight is actually one of the best knights in the game. His light magic is good, but his heavy magic is the one that really brings him together. His heavy magic being able to stun multiple enemies at the same time is so useful, and it's also pretty effective against bosses, so that's why I'm gonna give him an 8.5 out of 10. You unlock him by beating the King's Arena, which is a pretty easy task since the enemies do a really low amount of damage. And after you beat the game with the Barbarian, you unlock the Beekeeper. The Barbarian's starting weapon is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, it's literally called the Barbarian Axe, but anyways, it gives -1 magic and has a 1% crit chance. Yeah, it's not really the best weapon. Alright, let's talk about his magic. His light magic is pretty normal. I mean, it's just an axe that does regular damage, and his heavy magic rains weapons from the sky, and it also does pretty average damage. The thing I don't like about his magic is that it's just a reskin of like arrow rains and knives, which is pretty lame, but like, I don't know, I didn't make the character. Since the Barbarian's a non-elemental character, his elemental infusion is armor pierce, which just does 5 times base damage. Alright, I've talked about the Barbarian enough. It's time to give my overall opinion. In my opinion, the Barbarian's pretty bad. He has really average magic that doesn't do a lot of damage, and there's like nothing special about him. I'm gonna give him a 5 out of 10. You can unlock the Royal Guard by completing the game with the Green Knight, and after beating the game with this character, you unlock the Saracen. Anyways, the Royal Guard starting weapon is the Falcon, which gives the player +1 strength and +3 defense. Okay, let's talk about the Royal Guard's magic. His light magic throws bombs that set enemies on fire, and his heavy magic rains arrows from the sky. And since this character doesn't have any element, his elemental infusion is armor pierce, which does 4 times base damage. Now that I've been talking about this character for a little bit, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. The Royal Guard isn't really anything special. His magic is super basic and it's really not that great. Apart from the bombs being pretty good, the Royal Guard isn't really good for much. But considering all of this, I'm gonna have to give him a 6 out of 10. You can unlock him by purchasing the Purple Knight DLC, and since he's a DLC character, he doesn't unlock anybody after you beat the game with him. But anyways, the Blacksmith starting weapon is the hammer, which gives the player +3 strength, but it does take away 1 agility. This character is light magic. There's a flaming hammer that sets enemies on fire, and his heavy magic is a frog that can lick multiple enemies. And the Blacksmith is also a non-elemental knight, which means his elemental infusion is armor pierce, which does 4 times base damage. Alright, now that I've given the Blacksmith a brief overview, it's time to give my overall opinion on him. I think the Blacksmith is a pretty decent character. I mean, his magic is nothing crazy, but it is good enough to get the job done. His light magic is definitely better than the heavy one, but he is a pretty fun character to play, so I'm gonna give him a 7 out of 10. This character can be unlocked by beating the game with the Industrialist, and after you complete the game with the Fencer, you don't unlock any characters. This character's starting weapon is the Fencing Sword, which gives the player +1 strength, +1 magic, and +1 agility. Okay, let's talk about the Fencer's magic. His light magic throws saws at enemies, and his heavy magic throws buzz saws from the ground that hit enemies multiple times. And the Fencer is a non-elemental character, so his elemental infusion is armor pierce, which does 4 times base damage to enemies. Now that I've given the Fencer a brief overview, it's time for me to give my final thoughts on him. Personally, I think the Fencer and the Industrialist are the 2 best characters in the game because their heavy magic is just so good against bosses. And it also does pretty well against beefy enemies. Not only is the heavy magic good, but the light magic is also pretty solid. So because of that, I'm gonna give the Fencer a 10 out of 10. You can unlock the Grey Knight by beating the Barbarian boss. And after you complete the game with this character, you unlock the Stoveface. The Grey Knight's starting weapon is the Skinny Sword, which gives the player -1 strength, +1 defense, and +1 agility. Anyways, let's talk about this character's magic. His light magic throws a bomb that sets enemies on fire, and his heavy magic brings arrows from the sky. The Grey Knight is also a non-elemental character, so his elemental infusion should do 4 times base damage, but for some reason doesn't. I'll get more into that later. Anyways, now that I've been talking about the Grey Knight for a little bit, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. On paper, the Grey Knight doesn't seem too shabby. His magic is super simple. I mean, it's just bombs and arrows, right? Well, yes, his magic is normal, but the one thing about the Grey Knight is that his elemental infusion is pretty strange. See, most elemental infusions do 2 times base damage if it's an elemental knight and 4 times base damage if it's a non-elemental knight, and the Grey Knight is a non-elemental knight, so shouldn't he do 4 times base damage? Well, for some reason, he's only doing 2. I'm not really sure why this is, but anyways, that's gonna lower his score a little bit, so I'm gonna have to give the Grey Knight a 5.5 out of 10. Since the Blue Knight is one of the 4 starting characters, you don't have to do anything to unlock him, and after completing the game with the Blue Knight, you unlock the Industrialist. The Blue Knight's starting weapon is the Sheathed Sword, which gives the player +1 magic, and is also really hard to say. Anyways, let's talk about the Blue Knight's magic. His light magic throws an icicle that can freeze enemies, and his heavy magic rains big icicles from the sky. And since he's an ice character, his elemental infusion is the ice attack, which freezes enemies and does 2 times base damage. Now that I've given you guys some info on the Blue Knight, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. In my opinion, the Blue Knight is one of the best starting knights in the game. Although his magic isn't the best against bosses, it is very effective against beefies and regular enemies. And also you can stun lock with his elemental infusion, which is another really helpful bonus. So after considering all of this, I'm gonna have to give the Blue Knight an 8.5 out of 10. The Icecomo can be unlocked after completing the Icy Arena, and after beating the game with the Icecomo, you unlock the Brute. The Icecomo's starting weapon is the Fishing Spear, which gives the player +5 strength, +2 magic, and -3 agility. Anyways, this character's light magic throws a snowball that knocks over enemies, and his heavy magic rains icicles from the sky that freeze enemies in place. And since the Icecomo's an ice character, his elemental infusion freezes enemies in place, and it also does ×2 base damage. Alright, I've been talking about the Icecomo enough. It's time to give my overall opinion on him. I think that the Icecomo is a pretty solid character. His light magic is okay, but his heavy magic is really good. And also, since he's an ice character, he has that that really nice elemental infusion that can sunlock enemies in place. So after considering all of this, I'm gonna give him a 7.5 out of 10. Really decent character. You can unlock the king by beating Pipistrella's cave in insane mode, and the king doesn't unlock anybody after you complete the game with him. This character's starting weapon is the king's mace, which gives the player +2 magic, +3 strength, and +3 defense. Anyways, let's get into his magic. The king's light magic throws a golden knife that does pretty average damage, and his heavy magic can heal himself and other players. Also, the king is a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion does 4 times base damage. Alright, now that I've been talking about the king for a little bit, it's time for me to say my overall opinion. I think the king is one of the most interesting characters in the game. The main reason for that is that he can heal himself, and he is the only character in Castle Crashers that can do that. The only problem with his healing ability is that it heals so slowly that it's not even that useful, and his light magic is also not very great, so I'm gonna give the king a 5.5 out of 10. You can unlock this character by beating the game with the peasant, and after beating the game with the civilian, you don't unlock anyone else. This character's starting weapon is the pitchfork, which gives the player +1 strength and -1 agility. Alright, let's talk about this character's magic. His light magic throws knives that knock over enemies, and the heavy magic rains arrows from the sky. And since the civilian is a non-elemental character, his elemental infusion does 4 times base damage. Okay, now that I've been talking about this character for a little bit, it's time for me to give my overall opinion on the civilian. To be honest, he is just nothing special. His magic is definitely not the best, and he's really just a reskinned version of the peasant, without the chicken. Since the civilian's magic holds him back a lot, I'm gonna have to give him a 3.5 out of 10, just because he looks worse than the peasant. The Necromancer can be unlocked after defeating the Industrial Castle in Insane mode, and if you're not playing the remastered Castle Crashers, then he will be a DLC character that you have to buy. And also, the Necromancer doesn't unlock anyone on both versions. But anyways, the Necromancer's starting weapon is the Evil Sword, which gives the player +2 magic and +7 defense. His light magic is a skeleton that runs into enemies and explodes, and his heavy magic is skeleton hands that come up from the ground. Also, the Necromancer is a non-elemental character, so his elemental infusion is armor pierce. And yes, I know I don't have it unlocked with the Necromancer, but if you search it up on the Castle Crasher wiki, it tells you that he's a non-elemental character. Alright, now that I've given the Necromancer a quick overview, it's time to give my overall opinion. I think the Necromancer is a pretty solid character. Even though his magic is really cool, it is not the best in the game, as his skeleton is really easy to dodge. His heavy magic is pretty decent though, as it can hit enemies quite a few times, but other than that and the good starting weapon, he's nothing special. I'm just gonna give him a 7 out of 10. You can unlock this character by beating the Peasant Arena, and after you complete the game with him, you unlock the Civilian. The Peasant's starting weapon is the Wooden Spoon, which gives the player that uses it +2 agility and takes away 1 magic. The Peasant's light magic throws a knife at enemies, knocking them over, and his heavy magic rains arrows from the sky. I know, pretty original. And since this is a non-elemental character, his elemental infusion attack does 4 times base damage. Okay, I've talked about the peasant enough. It's time for me to give my overall opinion on him. To be honest, the peasant is a very basic character. His magic is one of the most common types in the game, and fighting enemies with it is pretty painful. So I'm gonna have to give the peasant a 4 out of 10. He can be unlocked after beating the game with the fire demon. And also, the ninja doesn't unlock anyone after you complete the game with him. This character's starting weapon is the Ninja Sai, which gives the player +6 agility, -2 defense, and has a 2% crit chance. Anyways, the ninja's light magic throws a shuriken at enemies that does average damage, and his heavy magic is a smoke cloud that hits enemies multiple times, also doing pretty average damage. Wait, what fell off my desk? Alright, whatever. But anyways, the ninja is a non-elemental character, which means his elemental infusion attack does 4 times base damage, like literally almost every night in the game. Alright, now that I've been talking about the ninja for a bit, it's time for my overall opinion on him. I think the ninja is actually a pretty disappointing character, as he has this really cool log teleport attack in the level you find him in, but after you unlock him, he just doesn't have that attack. Instead, he has like the steam cloud magic, which is alright I guess, but it's nothing special. Anyways, since he has pretty mid magic, I'm gonna give him a 6.5 out of 10. And yeah, that is every single character in Castle Crashers reviewed in 1 minute. And I know the reviews aren't exactly a minute, because I did have to trim a little bit off, you know, because I didn't want to play the same intro every single time. But nonetheless, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.